So now it's time for the very fun part, which is actually painting on your page. So the supplies I have on hand for this are 1, my final sketch on watercolor paper. I have 3 brushes here. Again, they're in size 1, size 5, and size 9. These are my nice detail brushes. And then I have 4 pans that I've gone ahead and pulled out of my Winsor & Newton watercolor palette. You can follow along with whatever colors you'd like to, but again, here's my example. I just really like the way that these colors are working together. So this is what I'm using, but feel free to follow along with whatever colors you'd like. And I've also got my water dish with my do not drink tape and emergency paper towels just in case I need them. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Oh, and then I'm also going to be using my scrap paper to rest my palm so that I'm not getting my hand oils all over the page. So you don't have to do it, it's completely optional, but it's nice to have your hand resting on something as you paint. So I'm going to start with my petals up here, and I want those to be primarily pink and then have a touch of orange coming in with them. So I'm going to start by using my number 9 medium brush and really filling in that pan so that it gets nice and saturated with water. Sometimes I'll do color mixing on a separate palette, but for today, I want to keep it really simple, and I'm going to be pulling straight from the pan. When you use colors right from the tube or the pan, whatever your medium is, that's going to be the most vibrant and bright colors. So I'm not going to be doing a ton of mixing. The mixing I'll be doing, again, is on the page. All right, so I have a nice even coating on my brush. Lots of water on there. Pro tip with watercolor, if you're ever feeling like you're losing control or it's getting kind of messy, add more water because it'll make brush control a lot easier. All right, so I've got a nice juicy pan up here. I'm going to go ahead and start filling in that main flower. So I'm using my large brush to get these larger sections. And then when it comes to the edges, I'm actually going to switch over to my tinier detail brush. So same thing, I'll fill it in that pan, get it nice and coated with water. And then what I'll do is use the edges very carefully of this brush to really fine tune the way that the pigment is blending on the page. So one thing I want to point out here is I'm actually using my pencil marks to indicate where those white space areas are going to be. So I'm not actually painting over my pencil marks. You know, of course I am going to sometimes as a mistake, no worries. But for the most part, I want those pencil marks to actually indicate where there's no paint. So if we look over here at my example, these spaces in between the petals were originally pencil marks. So once the paint dried, all I had to do was erase out the pencil marks. And because the paint wasn't actually over them, they erased perfectly from the page. So as you're painting in, kind of consider those pencil marks as the boundary between where the paint should stop and end. So now I'm going to show you how I blend colors on page. So I'm going to fill up my detail brush with a nice little bit of this orange. Honestly, this orange pigment is so strong, so a little bit goes a long way. So I've got a nice even coating on my brush here, and I'm simply going to dip right here in the center and let it just naturally pool out to the other areas of that petal. So we're getting this really nice effect here where the outer areas of the petal are bright pink and the inner areas have more of an orange tone, and they blend together really nicely in the center. So I'm going to go ahead and switch back to, I'm going to use my medium brush for this actually. The larger brush, even though it's relatively small, it's actually a little too big for these petals. So I'm going to go back to my number 5 and fill in the other petals using that same technique. And now with the pink area filled in, I'll go ahead, grab a little bit of that orange, and just dip, dip, dip right in one area until it gently pools out to the rest. And remember, you can always switch between brushes, so you can use a larger brush for larger sections, and then switch to a smaller detailed brush to really fine-tune those edges. I do this all the time. All right, let's dab a little bit of orange in that center area. and just see what happens as it begins to dry. All right, so now that I have that flower petal entirely filled in, I'm gonna go ahead and do the rest of the pinkish orangey areas on my entire composition, simply because I wanna keep that paint water nice and fresh. If I were to do my blue stem right now, then that paint water would get a lot muddier, and then the next time I wanted to do my pink area, it would get duller and duller. So I could go ahead and paint my stem, go dump out my paint water, get new paint water, but I'm being a little lazy. So I'm just gonna go ahead and do all of the pink areas first, dump out that water, and then do all of the blue-green areas. And that way, again, the pigments will stay really nice and vibrant because the water will be clean the entire time. Remember, you can always rest your hand on your scrap paper. Then I'll switch, dab in a little bit of that orange. Now for larger areas, like this big front-facing petal, I'm going to switch to my largest of my detail brushes, which is a size 9. Remember, lots of water will make it a lot easier for you. And if you go over the pencil marks like I'm doing here, it's not the end of the world. They'll be showing through once that paint dries, but a few pencil marks make it feel more authentically watercolor. Honestly, it's those imperfections that happen with watercolor that make it one of my favorite mediums to paint with. And dipping in that orange so that it naturally just kind of blends in with that pink. Sometimes I'll do a few separate sections like this before I mix in that additional color, that orange, so the paint has a little bit more time to settle. It starts out so wet and goopy on the page, so it's okay to do a few sections at once before you go back over and switch to your additional color and dip it in. Oops, so I actually dropped a little bit of paint on my paper, but again, it's not the end of the world because I can just remove that in Photoshop later on. But I'm going to show you how you can actually remove that if it happened in an integral area or for a watercolor painting where you really wanted to cherish the original. I'm simply using paper towels and I'll press and lift up and it's pretty much gone. All right, and for my final areas, I think I'm going to have this last petal be mostly orange, just to mix it up a little bit. This orange paint is so saturated and opaque, you barely need any to make a difference on your page. Cool, and I'm gonna do the inverse of what I was doing before. I'm gonna use just a tiny bit of pink to blend into that orange. And that star is reminding me that I need to do 2 circles. So I'm gonna do a orangey pink one. I'm going to do a bright pink one, and then a pure orange one. Perfect. All right, so that is it for the pinky orangey sections of my watercolor. Now I'm going to go ahead, dump out my paint water, start with fresh paint water, and then go ahead and tackle the blue-green stem areas. All right, cool. So now that we have this first layer completed, it's all of that pink orangey tones, I've gone ahead, cleaned out my paint water. It's brand new. I'm going to go ahead and start on the second tone, which is going to be, again, those blue-green leaves. All right, so just like before, I'm going to work from left to right, because I don't want to smear my paint as I go since I'm right-handed. All right, I'm going to start by again filling up that turquoise palette and getting it nice and filled with pigment and an even coating on my brush. And for this, I'm going to vary the pressure of my brush a little bit. Here, I'll show you on the practice paper. So instead of just having it be one monoline stroke like that, I'm actually going to vary the pressure where it goes light, heavy, light, to get a nice variety and contrast in my shape. So feel free to do a few practice strokes on your practice paper or on your real paper right here, because again, we'll be cutting out the stuff we don't use. All right, so I'm going to start out kind of light, heavy, and light. Perfect. And I'm going to switch to my medium-sized brush, and while that paint is all still wet, I'm going to dip in that really nice deep indigo blue just to have some fun things happen on paper. Cool. And just like that orange, the indigo is really, really pigmented, so a little bit of paint goes a long way. All right, I'll switch to my medium brush, go back to my turquoise, and start filling in these leaves. Remember, when in doubt, always add more water. So as you see here, I've switched to a smaller detail brush to get those edges nice and crisp. And then I'll do that dip with the indigo with my paint still wet to get some nice little color blends happening here. Again, more water will help you with that blending. Time for that next stem. And same thing, I'll switch to that indigo and just do a few little dips right onto the line there. Perfect. I'll go back to my turquoise and finish out these stems. There's some really fun things happening as these colors begin to blend together. Same thing, just dipping that indigo in, bringing more water onto the areas to really encourage that blend. All right, same thing here. Light, heavy, light pressure. I'll switch to the indigo color and just do some fun little drops in here to encourage that blending. It's constantly just switching between pans, between brush sizes. And if it's ever not blending very well, just add more water into those sections, and that'll really help the blend take place. I have to be careful not to rest my palm on the wet areas of the paper. Maybe the second leaf will be predominantly indigo. So one thing I want to point out here as I'm painting is I'm not leaving a lot of white areas within the paint. It's all very deep and saturated and opaque. And the reason I'm doing that, it's actually intentional. It's because when I scan these in later, when you have a lot of lighter white areas within your painting, it becomes a little bit trickier to remove that white paper texture background. So as a default, when I paint, I try to make it a little bit more opaque and fill it in with more color. So for me, the deeper and more saturated the pigment, the better, simply because it makes removing that background a little bit easier. And don't forget to go ahead and paint in your dots with your alternate color. All right, so at this point, I've gone ahead and completed my painting. So the next step is I want to wait for this to dry in its entirety before, here it is my eraser, before I use my eraser to erase out those errant pencil marks. It'll dry a lot faster if you put your paper under the sun, or if you want to go even faster, you can use a hairdryer to gently blow hot air onto your paper, which will make it dry very quickly. And one more thing I want to do before we forget is, again, using my pencil, I'm going to do a few practice signatures on my page so that I have a signature that I can infuse somewhere into my pattern. So again, this page doesn't have to be perfect, so maybe try out a few. So my signature is Cat Coke. Actually, that one looks pretty good. I might just go with that. So, but feel free if you want to try out some different styles, some different types of signatures, and really find one that's working best for you. The most important thing in a signature, in my opinion, is that it's legible. So if someone ends up purchasing this pattern or an art print, they can easily see my signature on that piece, Google my name, and then find more examples of my work. So when you find a signature that's working for you, just go ahead and put a little star by it, and that will be your reminder to use that signature later on when we're digitizing. I'm using a pencil, but you could also do your signature with pen, marker, Sharpie, anything goes. All right, so I'm going to let this dry in its entirety, and then I will erase out the pencil marks and digitize it.